I never really understood just how overpowered the VKK was. I knew that it was a very, very strong vehicle. This is of course the tier 10 German reward vehicle, but today's video is going to show you how even I was able to have some pretty good results, and of course showcasing what the top level players can also achieve in this vehicle, showing why this tank is definitely one of the strongest in the game, and why it is literally better in almost every way than the King Lerva at tier 10 from the tech tree. So without further ado, let's get into it. And of course, starting off, you have this tank. It is a 750 alpha damage tank with standard rounds that have very mediocre penetration, 246, which is basically not enough to go through a lot of the heavy tanks that you're going to be meeting. But have no fear, because this tank gets 350 heat pen, which is an additional 104 penetration. So firing standard rounds in this vehicle is almost pointless. You were better off in almost every situation firing heat rounds, other than maybe the side of vehicles that have a lot of track armor. So with that being said, yeah, the VKK has some pretty amazing gun statistics, and combine that with a relatively decent damage per minute of nearly 3000 for a heavy tank with this alpha. And of course that armor model is really, really good, because not only does it get a amazing upper plate, it gets a very, very solid turret to all intents and purposes. Gets a big lower plate which can be penned, but it is a flat penetration kind of plate that essentially you have to have 280mm or more to go through this thing, and if you do, then pretty much every time you will go through it. But if you don't, you're going to basically not be able to pen this, and even in the weakest point on the turret, which is a very, very small shot either side of the mantler of the VKK, you're going to find it a little bit difficult to reliably pen this vehicle, other than the fact of if it maybe tries to side scrape, which you might have thought as a rear mounted vehicle that side scraping would be the play. Unfortunately, that isn't the case with the VKK, and often you're actually better off coming around a corner, exposing that lower plate, and then kind of turning around and firing when they do fire at you. And so you can often actually bounce more shells by essentially over angling the front of your vehicle and then poking round and dealing your damage, as opposed to kind of reverse side scraping out, allowing people to pen this area right here, which is the exact same as the Panzer 7 and can be penned really easily. Alongside, if you're not actually facing your turret directly at the opponent, you're going to find that they can pen the side of your turret as well. So you have to make sure that at all times you've got your turret looking towards the opponents. So you have to be very careful when you see this tank and how it's actually played. If you see someone using it like this and using the frontal armor like this and not exposing the side armor, then you probably know that they have some level of competency in the vehicle. And of course, if you see them angling like this, then you're going to find that they are probably not the most experienced, although sometimes you can use it like this to be able to get some shots when you know someone's fired and only peek out very quickly. So that's kind of the differences in playstyles and armor model of this tank. It is definitely a very, very strong one. It's just that lower plate can be a pain. Now, one thing that is incredible about this vehicle is that although it's gigantic and huge, and unlike most of the heavy tanks in this tier, it actually gets relatively good gun depression. Now, you have to be using it over the side to get the maximum gun depression of 7 degrees, allowing you to fire down on a lot of the opponents, and people will try and go up next to you thinking that they basically can't be hit. But the difference is because you're so huge, what you can do is you can look down onto the top of their turrets, and with 350 heat pen and a 15cm, you can often overmatch the roof of tanks as well as shoot down into the top of it, allowing people to be penned. So going right up next to this tank can work if you're very, very small, but for the most part you're going to really struggle, and often this thing can turn and push you out of the way to expose your turret and shoot down into you. So you have to be very careful when it comes to that, and often you want to go around the side, make sure that you track it, making it a little bit more easier to kind of take out, and you'll find it a lot easier to fire against. So in my opinion, there are two kind of ways that you can play this tank. You either have the option to go for the close quarters fighting build with your field modifications, if you've got them unlocked by the time time you kind of go through this, and that is of course hardening, rammer and V-stabs. This is one of the biggest things. V-stabs allowing you to reduce your dispersion, which allows you to fire on the move, and this tank is actually quite good at doing that. And then of course, if you're in longer range maps where you think that you're going to have to move around a lot, dropping the hardening to use turbo is something that you can do so that you can mobilize around the map a little bit quicker and just maintain your speed throughout the entire map. So that's kind of how we set up this tank. But of course, let's take a look at what the game was actually like when we tried it out. So I tested out this vehicle and I saw exactly what this thing can actually do in the game, and even I was able to have some really nice games where we felt like we dominated the battlefield. But there's probably more to do with the tank than necessarily my skill level in this vehicle. Now of course, this vehicle has one of the big guns that is within this tier, and that allows you to do some pretty crazy things, not only because you can deal a ton of damage every single shell of 750, but also because of the fact that you also get a whopping main armament, which of course can overmatch a lot of vehicles, and hence why we were able to punish the Object 590 here. Now this tank doesn't get the best accuracy in the game, however for the size of its gun, its accuracy is really good, which is why I enjoyed playing this tank as much as I did. Now of course, this is the Clan Wars reward vehicle, and so often a lot of people are going to struggle against this vehicle because they don't see it a whole lot. So the weak points are very similar to its tech tree counterpart, the Panzer 7. However, this tank has significantly stronger armor, whereby the lower plate of this thing is thicker. It also gets better kind of side armor in terms of its little areas on the left and right of the tank, which you can pen. But the whole point about this tank is it is somewhat infinitely better than the Panzer 7, and it almost makes it feel pointless to even use the Panzer 7 when you have this thing in the game. Now unfortunately here we don't manage to hit the VK before he's able to pull back behind the building, which is absolutely fine, but because of the armor of this tank you really don't have to worry about tier 8 tanks reliably penning you, and this sort of angling of this tank makes it somewhat better to be able to do what you need to do. Now of course we pull around, he bounces off of us because all we're really exposing is the upper and lower plate of our vehicle at a weird angle, and to be able to pen, it's going to be quite difficult for them to do that, especially with the reduced penetration that tier 8s have. But of course this tank not only has, you know, very nice armor when it comes to effectively blocking damage, but it also has very good penetration for a heavy tank. This tank's heat rounds are incredible, 350 heat pen, which for a tier 10 is just crazy, literal crazy for a heavy tank to have this much damage, and of course this much penetration, and basically rivaling a lot of the tier 10 tank destroyers here. Now you're seeing me here just trying to go for the weak point of the Panzer 7, which as with this vehicle is here, but with this vehicle they're a lot slimmer, they're not as big of a profile. However, when you do try and side scrape out in the traditional way, like the Panzer 7's doing here, doesn't end up all too well, and unfortunately we hit the rear part of the vehicle there. However, the STRVK has now pulled into the middle area of the map that we're going to have to deal with if we want to be able to kind of win this game, at least reliably anyway. So we come around, we find the Panzer 7, I go for a quick shot, obviously could have gone for a different area there, maybe going for the lower plate. He was turning, so you know, it's one of those things where either we stay there and wait and try and aim, which was probably the play as no one else was realistically near me, but don't worry because this next shell goes straight into the side of the STRVK, who knew that we were here, but for some reason reversing with his turret turned the wrong way. Yeah, not the best idea to give everyone the weak point of your tank. And there you go, he's gone. But of course the Panzer 7's now kind of side scraping off of the corner. Now you can do it with this tank, but once again you probably want to just angle the frontal armor and pull around, because yeah, the frontal armor of this tank's crazy. Now I know that I'm probably going to take an E4 hit here, but it's fine. We want to get a bit more damage in this game, picking us up to 4,400. And if you haven't already noticed, we've also picked up a little bit of spotting, because of course, when you're the aggressive tank that just pushes forward, you don't really have any problems with getting some assistance damage, as you're usually the one that's kind of spotting, or at least having the opportunity to spot, as long as there's not another medium tank near you. And I mean, with this vehicle, we actually have the kind of maximum spotting as well, which is always funny. Now we load a HE round here to go for the Waffle Panzer IV, who's going to give us everything, and then, no, never mind. However, I did want to note that this tank also gets really good HE rounds, and that's because it has 85mm of penetration with its HE, and it also deals, on average, 950. As long as you can hit. And of course, we don't manage to hit, taking 2 pens in return. So yeah, that 950, it didn't come our way, and we probably received 950 in return. So yeah, not ideal trade with that one. But either way, they went through the side. You can see the weak point that we were talking about earlier, where they can pen through. And of course, this is a weak point. So if you're coming up against this thing, which you're probably more likely to do than to actually pick up this vehicle, you're going to have to try and avoid that. And we tried avoiding the Waffle's hit there. We went for a really steep angle, but he still managed to pen our lower plate, which, you know, to all intents and purposes, puts us on a one-shot for both of the vehicles that I'm really contending with here, the E4 and also that Panzer VII. So we can't really do a whole lot at this point in the game, although, you know, we can try and poke out, we can try and get a bit of damage on some of these guys as the game kind of progresses. But we're currently proxied by the E4, but that's not really a problem. I mean, they already know that we're here, we've been here for a while, and so all I have to do now is essentially wait for the team to push up. Things like the STB-1 and the T-54E1, they're all kind of sitting in the middle of the map, and they're coming around the back end of these guys. Now, I'm thinking in my brain here, maybe there's someone trying to come around from behind, and there you go, a VK was trying to come from behind, but unfortunately for him, doesn't make it anywhere near us. But with that being said, now the team actually make their way from behind, allowing us the opportunity to start progressing. The E4 is starting to reverse, and we get one into the side of the Panzer VII there for a nice little 500 roll. And as the game goes on, if you can survive in this vehicle, if you can not get taken out within the first couple of minutes, you're going to find yourself racking up easy damage. It's really a game of kind of surviving and finding your shells throughout the game to get a ton of damage. And there you go, the final shot on the E4, picking up 6.5 basically 1,000 damage and 1,691 assistance as well. So you might be thinking, okay, that was an okay result, but what happens when someone that's actually good at the game, or at least very good at the game, ends up in this vehicle? Well, that's exactly what this replay is going to showcase, and this is why this tank is unbelievably good, because even I can have a decent result in the first one. To all intents and purposes, I'm sure I would have been able to have a better one if we had longer to kind of try out the vehicle. But of course, this is what happens when you have the pinnacle game in the VK, and why this tank is just unbelievably good. You can see here, just going for some easy shots into the front of tier 10 heavy tanks like the ST2, and unfortunately for the Progetto, he had a bit of a bad time. He must have got pushed over or something, but yeah, unfortunate for him, he's straight out of the game earlier. So with that being said, of course, yeah, the 350 heat pen, absolutely no problem for going through the side of things like the Type 5 Heavy, and even the front of Type 5 Heavies, they are going to find it very difficult. Now you can see, I'll play here, Kozanek is actually turning the hull of the vehicle when he sees someone is aiming at him, and that allows him to essentially be able to have a better chance of bouncing. They're going to have to aim for one area, maybe they end up hitting the wrong area, and then of course he's going to be able to bounce the shell, and this is what makes this tank ridiculous. And to be honest with you, this is one of the tanks that I think is very overpowered in terms of how it plays, and not only is it overpowered, but it's also a Clan Wars reward tank that you have to be pretty good at the game in order to actually obtain. And so you've got a very powerful vehicle played by some of the very best players in the game. Of course, you can see where that starts to become a problem when it comes to public matches and not playing in some of these competitive game modes, like you'll see with some of the other tech tree vehicles that maybe aren't so good. And so With that being said, of course, now you can see he can push, and pushing in the VK is one of the easiest things I think you'll probably ever see. And Kozenak here is already up to 5.3k damage, taking the first hit of the game, having done so from an STRV, which is not really surprising considering the STRV's pen is just unbelievable. But unfortunately, that one went super high and probably didn't end up hitting the STRV there. But it doesn't matter, because in about 14 seconds later, he's going to be able to fire off another one. And guess what? I assume that the STRV's probably still in the same area. And we'll see at the end of this game whether he did indeed hit the STRV, and we can probably work it out if the STRV gets spotted next. Now, most heavy tanks would probably have to sit back in this vehicle. But no, this tank is not about sitting back, it's about taking the fight to the opponents, and it is probably one of the easiest heavy tanks that I've technically played. You don't feel very threatened by anything in the game. Now sure, you can take damage from people, and certainly you don't want to be throwing yourself away against people like you saw in probably my replay, but of course when you play it more passively, because of the alpha of this tank and because the armor actually works, in the later stages of the game you can really just push people and they can really not do a whole lot against you. And when you're on the move, it makes hitting those weak points even harder, and yeah, when it's chunking away damage like it does, yeah, people find it very difficult to deal with you. So with that being said, of course you can see the Concept 5 and the ST2 up in the hill area. The Concept and the ST2 have been trying to get damage on this guy, and you can see here when he does expose directly to the vehicles, they can hit that lower plate, and it is a weak point. You do get pen there, and you can see when people start firing heat at you, this 430 for example has penned him twice out of 2 shells. So it's really a case of trying to angle as best as you can and making sure every time you can fire you're going to hit your shots. And you can see here the Concept's probably in there. Doesn't look like he hit him because he would have taken him out of the game, and so he's up to 7.7 thousand. He's angling again against this guy, but because of the heat round it just goes straight through the lower plate. He's probably a little bit miffed that that one even hit and that it even penned, so yeah, I'd been fuming as well. The 430 now is in a bit of an annoying spot because he's just going to keep poking every time he fires, or at least if he's spotted. But you can see here he's just trying to get rid of that Concept because it's going to be a pain. It's going to keep spotting him, whereas if the ST2's over there, it's going to be harder for him to be able to spot. Now this game, although he's done 7.7 thousand damage already, it is far from over, and the enemy team are still winning on hit points, so you can kind of tell what kind of game this is going to be. And you can see he's being a little bit more careful. He knows that he needs to preserve his hit points, which is what I definitely don't do when I'm playing in this tank. I just roll in, playing like probably most people would in a tank that you feel overpowered in, and probably ending up playing it underpoweredly because you're so bad. But either way, with 8.3k damage done, he takes a hit from the 114 there on the move, which was a bit unlucky there to get penned in the front, but once again probably hitting the frontal armor in the lower plate. As you can see, getting peppered in that lower plate, which is where if you can get hold down in this tank, you're going to have some incredible games. Now this is not what you want to find. A Kranvang firing heat rounds, penning you through the lower plate. Can he avoid it? Oh, gets saved by the teammate there, potentially. Maybe the Kranvang would have bounced the other two, but you never really know. So luckily doesn't end up getting taken out and leaves him on what you would say a gnat's cock of a hit points left. So with nothing left really, he's got to play very passively, or at least play very safely if he wants to survive this one. Can he get a shot using the good gun depression of this tank? Yes, he can. And gun depression is something that we haven't talked about with this tank, because if you thought this gigantic Goliath would have bad gun depression, you'd be wrong. This actually has incredible gun depression, allowing you to kind of hit even tanks that get up right next to you with this tank. So yeah, it feels very nice. And of course you can push them out of the way to push them further away to get shots down into the turret. And because you've got heat rounds, you can pen them a lot of the vehicles through the turret, so doesn't become a problem for like other most heavy tanks, things like the E100, who are much more inflexible when it comes to their gun depression. Now you can see he's got a HE round here loaded, and for God's sake, much like we had in the first game that we played, he doesn't manage to hit the paper tanks with the HE rounds. I'm sure if he was loading a heat, it would have RNG'd him straight there, but don't worry. He uses the medkit here to make sure he's got full accuracy when he's on the move, etc. And so, with that being said, he's going to try and poke this gorilla. Can he find a shot? Not looking likely, but he can't really poke the 114 without potentially getting hit by the ST2, and everyone loads the HE, and there you go, connects with the gorilla 15, putting one straight into the side of him. The ST2 bounces, which gives him just enough time to pull back down the ridge and get into a safer spot. For God's sake, the Concept 5 comes rolling around, the tank that he was worried about from the very beginning of this game, and finishes him off. But can his team actually secure the win in this one? Let's find out. And of course they can't. Having done 10,900 damage showing, let's see what the team ended up with, the team results. So the real question is how much damage did Kozanak actually do in this game? Well, 13,126, with his team doing significantly less than him all combined, and that means that he must have hit someone blind. And who exactly did he hit blind? Well, the STRV did take 2 hits and took 1,536 damage, which means that he did hit him twice, and the STRV definitely felt a little bit miffed, I guess, being hit twice by the VK. But with 13,000 damage just on his own in this game, still losing must have felt absolutely terrible. And although he did have a loss to his name, I don't think he could have done a whole lot more in the VKK there. And even if he was to get rid of course, the Concept, he would have had a lot of other vehicles to contend with, and yeah, probably still would have lost that game. But either way, Kozanak had a brilliant game. This really truly shows what this tank can do. It surprised the hell out of me, and hopefully it was an interesting one for you guys to watch. Make sure to like the video if you did, and of course subscribe if you want RNG like you saw in this game. And I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.